Auckland Council Amendment Bill number 3, third reading.
Call on Members' Order of the Day number 2.
Healthy Homes Guarantee Bill number 2, first reading.
A point of order, Chris Hipkins.
Mr Speaker, I seek leave for the House to rise for the evening after the vote on the Healthy Homes Guarantee Bill number 2.
Can I just want to ask a question about whether that leave would extend the House if the House is still going at 10 o'clock. Well, the answer is that it would, and members understand that. The question is that leave be agreed to, the House rising after the vote on this next bill. Is there any objection? Yes. There is objection. Right. Unfortunately, the strict rules of the House are that once leave has been put and rejected, it can't be put again. I'm going to say that I was a little deaf, and I didn't hear the member coughing. All right. So there is no objection. The House will rise at the conclusion of the bill. Andrew Little.
Mr Speaker, I move that the Healthy Homes Guarantee Bill number 2 be now read a first time. I nominate the Government Administration Committee to consider the bill. Mr Speaker, it sometimes looks from the outside in this House that much of what we do doesn't look like it has a lot of significance, or at least you don't get to see the significance of it. And sometimes it feels that way too when you're sitting in this House. But Mr Speaker, the bill that we're considering now will help thousands of New Zealanders, and most importantly, it will help thousands of young New Zealanders. Mr Speaker, this bill does some very important things to improve the lives of New Zealanders, many of whom are on low incomes and many of whom presently are in substandard housing. The principle that sits behind this bill is a pretty simple one, that no New Zealander, adult or child, should have to live in a house that makes them or their children sick. It's that simple. Every Kiwi kid deserves to grow up in a home that is warm, safe and dry. As parents, and as a parent myself, I wouldn't accept anything less for my own child. Mr Speaker, this bill does a number of things. It sets standards for rental housing, or private rental housing, and in fact public rental housing too. Standards are set after 6 months of the bill coming into effect, and then new leases that are in existence 12 months after the legislation comes into effect would have to comply with the standards that have been promulgated. And then 5 years after the legislation would come into effect, every lease would have to comply.
Slower than the government.
The bill would require MB to set standards for heating and insulation. And the standards will have to describe what constitutes adequate methods of heating, adequate methods of insulation, adequate indoor temperatures, adequate ventilation, adequate draft stopping and adequate drainage. And the regulations will have to describe suitable measures for each of those points. And the regulation, or at least the legislation, will allow for exemptions to be provided for in the regulation. Mr Speaker, I make those points to be very clear because some of the objections that have been registered by the government, or at least its Minister of Building and Housing in the last 24 hours, have misled New Zealanders about, in fact, what the bill does. And it is interesting, however, the change in position that the Minister has taken. 2 days ago, the Minister was concerned that the bill requires properties to be insulated at a pace that is totally unrealistic. A day later, he said that the bill was slow in timing, that it has a timetable 4 years slower for insulating rental properties than the government's residential tenancies bill. Mr Speaker, I am looking forward to the Minister's contribution tonight because I'd like to know what the third position is that bumbling Nick Smith is going to take on this particular bill. Mr Speaker, the Children's Commissioner Russell Wills, when he was making his submission on the government's legislation that merely requires rental housing to have the 1978 insulation standard complied with in 4 years' time, he said that right now 42,000 New Zealand children a year are going to hospital for respiratory infections, bronchial problems, asthmas, and things associated with unhealthy homes. Unhealthy homes that are unhealthy because of dampness, lack of ventilation that allows mould spores to proliferate. That's the problem we are trying to fix. It is a reasonable demand to have in the 21st century that New Zealanders in rental accommodation have a minimum standard that at least keeps them healthy. The idea that we continue to allow 42,000 Kiwi kids to have to go to hospital for avoidable and preventable infections is just totally intolerable. The Children's Commissioner also said that up to 15 deaths of children a year are at least partly attributable to unhealthy homes. That is a disgrace. We can stop that, and tonight's vote will be the first step towards doing just that. Mr. Speaker, every rental property should be insulated, should be weathertight, and should have adequate heating. I don't think it is too much to ask. Mr. Speaker, I've had a lot of correspondence from a lot of New Zealanders in recent weeks and days. The mother of a child who has been repeatedly unwell because of the house that they live in wrote to me. Her name, Estelle, and she was living in Auckland at the time, told me in her email that her house had no insulation, it was damp, mould was growing on her son's toys. He got asthma and he had to go to hospital. And what she told me was that she carried the guilt of her unwell son with her until she was able to move out of that house. She felt so guilty that she could not keep her child well. She's on a low income. She got the best house that she could afford, but it was an unhealthy home, and she should not be put in that position. No parent in New Zealand should be made to feel guilty about the conditions in which they are often forced to accommodate their children. And no child in New Zealand should be in a position where they have to get sick like that. Mr. Speaker, this matters to all of us in New Zealand because we want to be part of communities that are strong and vibrant and where everybody gets a fair chance. You see, when a child lives in a home that makes them constantly sick, that means they have to take days off school, that means that mum or dad might have to take time off work as well, that affects the household and it affects that child's future. And if we are serious about being a country that fulfills our commitment and that basic Kiwi dream, that no matter the circumstances into which you are born, we will have a country, an education system, a health system, and housing that means that you can lift yourself up and do the best you can and be the best you can be throughout the rest of your life. When young children live in houses that make them sick, they are denied that opportunity. This is about fairness and justice and equality. It is hardly surprising that we have ongoing problems with housing and accommodation in New Zealand when we see what's happening with houses and home affordability in New Zealand. That in the city of Auckland, the average price of an Auckland house now 9 times average income, and that we have the lowest home ownership in 64 years. That is a symptom of the fact that more and more people are dependent on rental accommodation. This bill is about standing up for those New Zealanders. This bill gives voice to New Zealanders who have been suffering and struggling in silence for far too long. And this is about doing the right thing and the decent thing. It's about doing the Kiwi thing. Mr. Speaker, it is sad that the National Party so far has expressed their opposition to this bill. And my colleague Phil Twyford is going to go through some of those objections. But it is interesting that the Commissioner for Children had this to say in relation to a budget promise made a few years ago by this government that undertook to make homes healthy again. And he said the government's bill that is currently going through this parliament fails to meet that promise. He said that government made a promise to New Zealand children that we will make your house healthy. And 3 years on from that budget promise, the government's bill will do little for children living in cold, damp, mouldy housing. It is a wasted opportunity and a broken promise to our children. Mr. Speaker, I urge government members to fulfil their promise. Vote for this bill and make life, a pleasant life, a safe and healthy life in rental homes in New Zealand a reality for the children of New Zealand and their parents. It is that easy for this House tonight to do that, and I urge the government to support my bill.
The question is that the motion be agreed to.